Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And just before we get down to our next featured machine, just a quick thank you to all of my YouTube viewers out there who have been leaving mainly positive comments on my video posting. So it's good to know that you're enjoying my video content. But thanks again for your support of my channel. So as I said, we're going to stay with the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this is another superb machine that I came across during my travels at the 2023 show. So let's dive straight into our next video posting and take a look at this beautiful 1966 Mark I Model 11 250 Bultaco Pursang. Okay, so this is another fantastic looking classic that I came across at the Telford Dirt Bike Show in 2023, and this superb looking motorcycle here is a 1966 Mark I Model 11 250 Bultaco Pursang, and this bike here is a fully original machine from that 1960s era, and this is bike number 479 off the Bultaco production line, and it was part of the 666 machines that Bultaco produced of this model in that year. But this bike here is certainly the real deal with matching engine and frame numbers. Now at first glance, these Mark I Bultacos are often mistaken for the Rickman Bultacos because they do look very similar when you first look at them, but there were subtle differences from the Don and Derek Rickman bikes, because these Bultacos chassis were made from just standard steel tubing, while of course the Rickman frames were made from Reynolds 531 steel that was then nickel plated. And also the colour of this bike is slightly lighter than you would have found on a similar coloured yellow Rickman machine, and this stock 250 also had a small rear mudguard at the back, which although looks similar to the Rickman bikes, was actually very different. Now the engine that powers our Spanish Mark I is a 4-speed 250 two-stroke, and it's said that Bultaco made two variants of this engine on this 66 bike, one that had the round radial cooling fins on the cylinder head, and this straight finned example here, which was naturally the Scrambles version. Now the fuel for the engine was delivered through an Amal monoblock carburetor, which was quite a popular choice on many different makes and models of motorcycles during the swinging 1960s. And as you can see, these Bultaco motors were quite famous as well for having their engine casings all highly polished, and this is more or less how they would have been presented straight off the Bultaco production line in that year. But these were still very powerful and strong and reliable engines. And also it was a high level exhaust expansion chamber that was fitted onto these 250 Bultacos, which was quite unusual for a 1960s Scrambles bike, because it was more prominent on the trials versions of these Bultacos at that time. But this exhaust certainly went over the top of the motor and then crossed over to exit through a small tailpipe on the left hand side of the bike. Now once again, I'm pretty sure that the bike's front forks on these Mark I 250s were Spanish beater units, because these beaters were certainly used on a multitude of different Bultaco Scrambles bikes in the 1960s and 1970s. But as you'd expect to see on a 1960s off-road bike, old school drum brakes, which as I remember, I think Bultaco were quite renowned for their chrome finish inside the drums, which didn't of course help the braking effort as far as friction was concerned, but it was much the same on this rear drum and brake, which like the front were both made of light alloy and had a similar kind of stopping power to that front hub and brake. So with regards to the Bultaco's rear suspension, now I was never actually told on the day which make and model of rear shocks that were bolted here into place on our Mark 1 250, but I do know that some of the later Bultaco bikes did use locally manufactured beater suspension units here on the back, so I'm guessing that these are just an earlier version of those shocks, which as you can see were very basic with limited means of adjustment, but again you have to remember that this was still the mid 1960s. But when you take a look at these Mark 1 Bultaco chassis, you can see that they're very well made, and you can also see why they're often confused with the British-made Rickman frames, because their design is quite similar, and when you compare it to this genuine Rickman chassis, which although looks identical, the Bultaco frames never of course had the oil in the chassis design that the Don and Derek Rickman frames had. But I think it's the overall appearance of this Spanish Bultaco that causes all of the confusion between the two bikes, because when you take a look at our 66 Mark 1 and then you compare it with a similar year Rickman, then the resemblance is without doubt uncanny. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty and all of the details of both of the bikes, then you soon find out that they're not the same at all. Now, the 250's driver's seat was just a basic single person type of affair, and not the longer items that you often find on some of the other British made scramblers of that 1960s period. And the actual fuel tank on our little Bultaco was made from old school fiberglass, as of course many fuel tanks of that period used this very same construction method, because these were the days before plastic was used on these kind of off-road dirt bikes. But again, more or less all of the bikes' side panels and front and rear mudguards were all made from that self-same material, because once the manufacturers had the initial moulds all made up, the construction process was quite simple, although these fiberglass items of course didn't have the same resilience to damage as its plastic counterparts. But whoever it was that restored this little beauty has certainly made a top-class job, that's for sure, because the bike still has its 1966 original parts bolted onto it, including these proper handlebars with that crossbar welded on and not using clamps, which again is how these old-style handlebars were actually made back in the 1960s. And these steel ball-end levers again were a pretty stock fitment on most of these scrambles bikes of that 1960s era, and not just on these Spanish Bultacos, but of course many of the British bikes as well. So it's certainly a credit to the bike's owner to display this quite rare Mark 1 Pursang in this fantastic condition, and I assume that if you were to walk into a Bultaco dealership in 1966 to buy one of these Mark 1 250s, then this is probably the kind of condition that you'd see one while it was sitting on that showroom floor. Although for their day, these Mark 1s were still decent bikes with that relatively light tubular steel Bultaco design frame, and of course this mega 250 two-stroke piston port engine, which just seemed to get better and better as subsequent Pursang models evolved during the coming years. But you can see that our featured bike here hasn't seen much dirt since it's been restored, which I've absolutely no problem with, because I still think that many of these rarer and more scarce vintage dirt bikes should be preserved in this kind of condition, so that we can still look back and see exactly what they were actually like if we could turn back the clock and visualize what these were like as a brand new machine. But once again, this is another belter of a bike, and yet another vintage gem from the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And this fantastic looking machine is just one of hundreds of bikes that you can take a look at if you ever take the time to visit the show that it takes place in February of each year at the Telford International Centre right here in the UK. Okay, so coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at another couple of British classic CCMs, and first up it will be this original 1977 500 CCM, and that will be followed by this lovely 1974 John Banks replica racer, and both of these bikes are part of the Rob Hughes Classic CCM collection. So make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel to check these out. But for the time being, thanks again for watching, and from all of us here at Classic Dirt Bike TV, it's goodbye for now.